In the spring of 1848, a Scotsman shaved the front of his head, sewed a false braid of hair into the back of his scalp, put on the robes of a Chinese merchant, and stepped into a country where his presence, in the regions he was heading for, was forbidden. He carried plant pots. His name was Robert Fortune, and he had been sent to commit what may be the largest theft in commercial history. Not gold, not jewels. He had been sent to steal tea. This is the story of how Britain, the most powerful empire on earth, found itself utterly dependent on a plant it could not grow, a trade it could not control, and a country it barely understood. It is the story of a drug war, a disguise, a glass box, and a heist that took 3 years and rerouted the economies of 2 empires. And it is the story of how the theft succeeded so completely that within 50 years, the victim had lost almost everything, and the thief had convinced himself it was all perfectly respectable. And stay for the detail nobody saw coming, because in the middle of this burglary, the thief stumbled onto something revolting about what Britain had actually been drinking for 200 years. We will get there. To understand why a botanist needed a disguise, you first have to understand what tea had done to Britain's money. Start with the habit. Tea arrived in Britain in the middle of the 17th century as an aristocratic curiosity sold by the ounce like medicine. Within 100 years, it had conquered every layer of society. By the 1840s, it was the national bloodstream. The average Briton drank close to 2 pounds of leaf a year, and a mill worker's family in Manchester would sooner cut back on meat than on tea. It was hot, it was safe to drink because the water was boiled, it made cold food feel like a meal, and it carried sugar, which meant it carried energy. An industrial workforce ran on it. Now follow the money. The government taxed tea ferociously, and for good reason. At times in the early 19th century, the duty on tea provided close to £1 in every 10 the Treasury collected. Tea paid for ships. Tea paid for wars. The East India Company, the licensed monopoly that shipped it, built one of the largest commercial fortunes in history on the leaf. And when the company lost its monopoly in 1834, a swarm of private merchants raced in behind it. The clipper ships, the fastest sailing vessels ever built, existed substantially because London would pay a premium for the first tea of the season. And every single leaf of it came from China. China grew it, processed it, priced it, and sold it to foreigners through one tightly controlled system at Canton. The rest of the country was closed. Foreigners were forbidden from traveling inland. The craft of tea-making, the withering, rolling, firing, the judgment in the fingers of a tea master was a guarded inheritance, and the export of tea plants was, to put it gently, not encouraged. For 200 years, Britain had been buying, in staggering quantity, a product it had never once seen made. Here is the arithmetic that frightened London. Britain paid for tea in silver because China wanted almost nothing else Britain sold. The trade imbalance drained silver east on a scale that alarmed the Treasury and obsessed the company. Their solution became one of history's great crimes, and it must be named plainly, because the tea heist does not make sense without it. The company grew opium in Bengal, auctioned it to smugglers, and pushed it into China by the thousands of chests, reversing the flow of silver by addicting a nation. When China's government finally acted, when the Commissioner Lin Zexu seized and destroyed 20,000 chests of the drug at Canton in 1839, Britain went to war. Not officially for opium, of course, officially for free trade and the dignity of the flag. The gunboats settled it. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 handed Britain Hong Kong, opened 5 ports, and bought the merchants their swagger back. But notice what the war did not win. It did not win the plant. It did not win the craft. China still held the monopoly where it mattered, in the soil and in the hands. And every year the silver and opium machine ground on, morally bankrupt and strategically fragile. If China ever cleaned up the drug trade or another war closed the ports, Britain's national drink, and 1/10 of its tax base, was hostage. Pause on how completely this drink had rewired Britain itself, because the dependence ran deeper than money. In 1784, tea duty stood at almost 120%, and the predictable result was that as much as half the tea drunk in Britain was smuggled, landed at night on Cornish beaches, moved inland by armed gangs, sold openly by respectable grocers who asked no questions. Parliament surrendered to arithmetic that year and slashed the duty to 12.5%. Smuggling collapsed within a season, legal imports more than doubled, and the Treasury learned the lesson every government relearns eventually, that a tax rate is a negotiation with reality. From then on, tea and the state were partners. When the Exchequer needed money for the wars against Napoleon, the duty crept back up, and the nation paid it, grumbling, because by now going without was unthinkable, and the man in the street never once asked where it came from, any more than he asked where the sun was manufactured. Tea came from the grocer. The grocer's tea came from London. London's tea came from the Canton waterfront, through a bottleneck so narrow it beggars belief. For generations, all legal foreign trade with the largest economy on earth squeezed through a single strip of warehouses outside one city's walls, under rules that confined foreign merchants to their compounds, forbade them the Chinese language, forbade them the interior, and reminded them annually that they traded at the emperor's pleasure. The system was called the Canton system. The merchants called it the factory system, and it worked in its way for 100 years, precisely because both sides made fortunes, and neither side had to understand the other. There was one way out, and everyone in Leadenhall Street could see it. India. The company ruled a subcontinent with Himalayan foothills, whose climate looked, on paper, like tea country. In the 1830s, a governor-general had even established a tea committee, and there had been a genuine discovery, a tough, broad-leafed tea plant growing wild in Assam, championed by a stubborn pair of brothers named Bruce. A small Assam industry was struggling into existence, but its early product was rough. The plantations were fever-ridden chaos, and the finest Chinese stock and the real craft remained out of reach. If India was ever going to replace China, someone had to go into the forbidden interior and take the best of everything. So the company made a decision that sounds like the plot of a heist film, because it is one. If China would not sell the golden goose, Britain would steal the eggs, the nest, and the goose's extended family. They needed a thief with a very particular set of skills. Someone who could identify the finest plants on Earth at a glance. Someone who could keep living plants alive across 10,000 miles of ocean. Someone who could pass through closed country without being lynched, and who was expendable enough that, if he were, the company could shrug. They found him in the greenhouses of the Horticultural Society at Chiswick on a salary of about £100 a year. Robert Fortune was a gardener's son from the Scottish borders, largely self-taught, with a talent for plants and a stubborn streak that shaded into the suicidal. He had already survived one collecting expedition to China after the war, hunting ornamental flowers for London's gardens. That trip tells you everything about the man. He caught fever in the Yangtze Delta and kept working. And on the voyage between ports, his junk was run down by pirate vessels on the coast. Fortune, shaking with fever, lay on the deck with a double-barreled shotgun, ordered the crew to hold course, waited until the lead pirate ship closed to point-blank range, and then stood up and emptied both barrels into the helmsman. He did this, by his own account, more than once that day. The pirates chose other careers. The company read his book about it and saw exactly what it was looking for. In 1848, they offered him £500 a year, 5 times his gardener's wage, plus expenses. His instructions survive, and they are refreshingly free of euphemism. Obtain the finest varieties of the tea plant and the seeds of the tea plant from the best districts of China, and convey them to the government tea nurseries in the Himalayas. He was also to acquire, where possible, skilled Chinese workmen. The best districts were, without exception, closed to foreigners. Fortune knew precisely what he was being paid for, so Fortune became someone else. The front of his scalp was shaved. A false queue, the long braid required of Chinese men under the Qing, was sewn into his hair. He dressed as a traveling gentleman and took a cover story. He was Sing Hua, an official from a distant province beyond the mountains, which conveniently explained his strange accent and stranger face. It was a thin disguise. It worked because inland China in 1848 was a patchwork of dialects and faces, because his servants did the talking, and because no one expected the absurd. A European, alone, months deep in the interior, hunting shrubs. It is worth knowing what the company had already tried, because failure is what made Fortune's brief so precise. In the 1830s, its tea committee had sent a secretary named Gordon to the China coast to buy seed almost blind. The tens of thousands of seedlings raised from his shipments were planted in the wrong districts on committee logic rather than growers' knowledge, and the survivors limped. Meanwhile, in Assam, the Bruce brothers' wild native tea had been declared genuine camellia by Calcutta's botanists in 1834, a discovery that should have settled everything, except that the experts then spent a decade trying to improve the sturdy local plant by crossing and replacing it with imported Chinese stock, on the confident assumption that anything Chinese must be superior. The Assam Company, floated in London in 1839 in a fever of speculation, nearly bankrupted itself, learning otherwise, its managers dying of fever, its clearings swallowed by jungle, its early teas arriving in London, tasting of the learning curve. By 1848, the lesson was written in red ink. Seeds were not enough. Plants were not enough. India needed the best stock from the best districts, and above all, it needed the craft, which is to say, it needed a thief who knew what he was looking at. His first target was the green tea country, the hill districts inland from Shanghai, around Sung Lo Mountain, where green tea had been perfected. He traveled by canal boat and sedan chair, sleeping in inns his servants judged safe, extracting cuttings and seeds, and crucially, watching. watching the pluck, the pan firing, the rolling, the timing, the knowledge no ship had ever carried. And it was here that 2 centuries of European belief fell apart in a single season. First discovery: green tea and black tea, sold in London as different plants, priced differently, argued over by the Royal Society, were the same plant. Camellia sinensis, 1 leaf. The difference was nothing but process. Fire the leaf quickly and it stays green. Let it wither and bruise and oxidize, and it turns black. A secret hiding in plain sight in 10,000 village drying sheds, invisible to a trading system that was never allowed past the warehouse door. Second discovery, and this one had teeth. In workshops preparing green tea for the export market, Fortune watched workers tip powders into the roasting pans in the final firing. The leaf came out a vivid, uniform, saleable green, the color foreign buyers had been taught meant quality. Fortune palmed samples of the powders. The analysis identified Prussian blue, a pigment, and gypsum. The dyeing was done, the workman cheerfully explained, because foreigners preferred it. No Chinese drinker would touch the stuff. By Fortune's arithmetic, London was swallowing roughly half a pound of pigment and plaster in every 100 pounds of export green tea. When the evidence went on display in London at the Great Exhibition in 1851, the green tea market shuddered and British taste swung permanently to black. The thief had, in passing, exposed the victim's fraud and used it to justify the burglary. The second campaign was harder, and it is the one that would have killed a less stubborn man. The finest black tea on earth came from the Wuyi Mountains, the Bohea of the old invoices. 200 miles further into the interior across country, no European had crossed in living memory. Fortune went in 1849 by riverboat and mountain chair, through checkpoints where his servants sweated and his cover story thinned. The Wuyi Range, when he finally stood in it, astonished him. Black cliffs split by green gorges, tea bushes terraced into every ledge and crevice, monasteries perched where the mist began. He lodged with Buddhist monks who had tended tea for generations, drank the finest cups of his life, poured by men who considered the leaf a form of prayer, and quietly, methodically robbed them blind. Cuttings, seeds, and the answers to 100 careful questions about soil, aspect, plucking, and fire. He walked out weeks later with the genetic heart of the black tea trade in his baggage train. The monks had charged him for candles. But discoveries were not the mission. The mission was extraction, and extraction kept failing. Collecting was the easy half. The hard half was the ocean. His first great consignment, thousands of plants gathered through a network of local collectors and shipped ahead to Calcutta, arrived dead. Worse than dead. Sabotaged by helpfulness, overwatered, cooked in the hold, mishandled in Calcutta's Botanic Garden. Of one shipment of some 13,000 young plants, the survivors could be counted on your fingers. Seeds fared no better. Tea seeds are oily. They turn rancid in weeks. Crates of them arrived as compost. 2 years of espionage, rotting on docksides. The answer already existed, and Fortune wielded it better than any man alive. A London doctor named Nathaniel Ward had noticed, years earlier, that a fern sealed inside a glass bottle lived for years untended, watering itself with its own recycled moisture. From that observation came the Wardian case. a sealed miniature greenhouse, and with it, the entire pattern of botanical empire. Rubber, cinchona, bananas, all of it would eventually move between continents in Ward's boxes. Fortune's masterstroke was a refinement so simple it reads like a joke. Instead of shipping seeds in crates where they died, he sowed them in the soil of the Wardian cases, under the feet of the growing plants. The cases left China as gardens and arrived in India as nurseries, the seeds germinating mid-ocean, unwatered, untouched, behind glass. In the winter of 1850 to 1851 came the final run, 16 Wardian cases, roughly 2,000 plants, uncounted thousands of germinating seeds, and the cargo that mattered more than all of it, 8 Chinese tea men, 6 manufacturers, and 2 lead workers recruited with 3-year contracts, carrying their tools, their pans, and a lifetime of craft that China had spent centuries keeping at home. Fortune delivered all of it up the Ganges to Saharanpur and onward to the Himalayan foothills. From that one voyage, nearly 13,000 seedlings struck root in Indian soil. It would be tidy to say those plants conquered the world, and the truth is messier and more interesting. Many of Fortune's Chinese bushes sulked in the wrong districts. The great engine of Indian tea would ultimately run on the native Assam plant and hybrids of the two. But Darjeeling, the high-grown champagne of teas, descends substantially from Fortune's Chinese stock. And the plants were never the whole theft. The craft was. The tea masters trained the first generation. The manuals were written from their hands. The estates industrialized what the villages had perfected. The knowledge, once out, could never be returned. Spare a thought before the numbers, for the 8 men who made the numbers possible, because history has not. The tea masters sailed from a country that regarded their departure as betrayal to a mountain frontier where nothing, not the language, not the food, not the fever, was theirs. They found the company's nurseries in disarray, and its overseers convinced they knew better. Contracts frayed, wages were argued over, and within a few years, most of the men had been discharged or drifted into other work, their names surviving mainly in complaint files and pay ledgers. They trained their replacements, which was the point, and were forgotten, which was also, in its way, the point. The knowledge stayed. The knowers were disposable. If the tea heist has a moral core, it is not in the glass cases. It is in the fact that the most valuable cargo of 1851 got the worst deal of anyone in this story. Now watch the numbers, because this is where a heist becomes an execution. In 1850, China supplied effectively all the tea Britain drank. India's contribution was a rounding error from Assam. By the late 1880s, the lines crossed. India's tea exports to Britain overtook China's for the first time, and they never looked back. Add Ceylon, where tea replaced a coffee crop wiped out by fungus, and by the turn of the century, the transformation was total. China's share of the British market collapsed from monopoly to a few percent within a single working lifetime. Plantation scale, imperial capital, steam shipping through the new Suez Canal, and 0 remaining secrets did to the Chinese export trade what no gunboat had managed. Britain, meanwhile, fell in love with its own robbery. The 1860s brought the clipper races, when the first ship home with the new season's tea earned a premium and the whole country followed the sport in the newspapers. In the Great Race of 1866, 3 clippers left Foochow on the same tide and arrived in London 99 days later within hours of each other, having raced across half the planet. It was the last romantic gasp of the China trade, and it was already obsolete. The Suez Canal opened 3 years later, steamships took the route, and the beautiful ships went into other cargoes or the breakers. By the 1880s, the empire's tea came increasingly from the empire itself, picked by indentured labor on Indian and Ceylonese estates, shipped in steel hulls, and sold by a new breed of grocer, a Glasgow showman named Thomas Lipton, buying entire Ceylon estates so he could paint the slogan "Direct from the tea garden to the teapot" across half the shopfronts in Britain. Tea had begun the century as China's gift at China's price. It ended the century as an imperial product, vertically integrated, brand-managed, and utterly British in the public imagination. The theft was not just successful, it was forgotten as a theft. The consequences landed on people who had never heard of Robert Fortune. The tea districts of southern China, whole regional economies built over centuries around the export trade, fell into depression as the foreign silver stopped coming. And the ledger has a second column, written in opium. The drug trade the tea deficit had justified kept growing for decades, reaching its flood tide late in the century, by which point China was also growing its own. The two commodities had traded places. Britain now grew China's tea. China now grew Britain's opium. History rarely writes its ironies that neatly. And Fortune? He went back to China twice more, once collecting for the Americans, whose own tea ambitions died in the Civil War. He wrote cheerful, best-selling travel books in which the espionage is described in plain sight, with the untroubled conscience of a man who genuinely believed he was advancing science and commerce, which, monstrously, he was. He grew prize flowers, sold his collections, and died in London in 1880, respectable, comfortable, and already half forgotten. He was never punished by anyone, never honored much by anyone, a gardener who had rerouted the economies of 2 empires and retired quietly to South Kensington. His grave gives no hint. There is a rose named after him. There is no statue. Consider what was actually stolen, because it is stranger than treasure. China kept every object it owned. Every bush was still rooted, every pan still hung in every shed. What was taken was a monopoly of knowledge, and that is the only kind of theft where the victim keeps everything and loses it all anyway. Once the plant and the craft crossed the water, China's greatest export industry was, in the language of our own century, open source. And the empire with the plantations, the shipping lines, and the tax collectors did the rest. There is a dark symmetry worth sitting with. Britain built its national ritual, the most domestic and innocent-looking of habits, on leaves acquired by espionage, financed by a drug pushed at gunpoint, and grown on conquered land by indentured labor. Then it wrapped the result in doilies and called it civilization. The cup on the table has a chain of custody, and almost every link was forged by someone breaking the rules and calling it trade. The final irony belongs to the present. The descendants of the stolen stock now grow from Kenya to Argentina, and Britain buys most of its tea from Africa. And China, a century and a half after the heist, is once again the largest producer and consumer of tea on Earth, its ancient craft intact, its export trade rebuilt, selling to a world that finally came back to the source. The monopoly could be broken, The bones of the craft, it turns out, could not be stolen after all, only borrowed for about 100 years. Empires rise on many things: steel, ships, banks, gunpowder. Britons rose, in some real measure, on a shaved head, a false braid, 8 poached craftsmen, and 16 boxes of glass. If someone in your family worked the tea trade, crewed the clippers, kept a grocer's scale, or picked leaf on an estate, put it in the comments. Those records matter more than the official ones.